Hello, everyone. Today is Thursday, January 20th, 2022, and my name is Regina Williams. On behalf of the entire Western Reserve Historical Society family, I want to welcome you to By the Book, a celebration of research, writing, and the grand reopening of our newly renovated library. This series, which is made possible in part with support from the George Gunn Foundation, should not be confused with the By the Book author interview feature of the New York Times Book Review. Although we're certainly riffing on their title, our inaugural series is unique in that it focuses on aspects of works published between 2020 and 2021 and written by or about Black or Indigenous people of color. Dr. Marvin A. McMickle's presentation is the first of the 3 all-virtual Zoom discussions comprising the second half of this inaugural series that we've been promoting since August of 2021. Because our authors have given us permission to record their presentations and make the content available after the final discussions, we ask that all guests mute their microphones during the presentations, submit questions via the chat at any time, and raise their Zoom hand if they want to ask questions during the final half hour of the program after Dr. McMickle's formal presentation. If we can all do that, we should be able to finish right on time at 7:30 p.m. On a personal note, I'd like to use part of my brief introduction to share information about the contributions that Dr. McMickle and members of the Antioch Baptist Church and leaders and congregants of other institutions have made to my own work and that of other scholars over the years. 20 years ago, for example, in the acknowledgement section of my first book, Cleveland, Ohio, for Arcadia Publishing's Black America series, I thank Dr. Marvin McMickle, Deacon Kelvin Berry, and the members of Antioch for their support of that publication, which included Dr. McMickle's introductory essay on the historic role of the African American Church. Soon after the publication of that book in 2002, Dr. McMickle hosted an informal gathering of Black faculty members at Antioch and individuals from institutions as far away as Oberlin College and Ashland, and as close as Cleveland State University and Case Western Reserve University, enjoyed an opportunity for professional networking, dining, and the drinking of red punch, which is a favorite in African American faith communities. When I launched the Praying Grounds Project on African American faith communities, a documentary and oral history at Cleveland State University, Dr. McMickle, the Reverend Dr. Larry L. Macon Sr., and other leaders in United Pastors in Mission agreed to support that effort by donating manuscript materials for the archive and allowing me to recruit oral history narrators in their churches. Like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Dr. McMickle's work has been both ecumenical and interreligious, and the Reverend Joan Brown Campbell and Rabbi Susan Stone were among the distinguished community leaders who joined Dr. McMickle in supporting my Cleveland Chautauqua project in the second decade of the 21st century. Time and time again, Dr. McMickle has demonstrated his belief in the power of diversity. Today, I'm also grateful to Dr. McMickle for his willingness to serve on the advisory board for the Journal of Traditions and Beliefs, the biennial scholarly e-publication of the Rashad Center Incorporated that reaches tens of thousands of people in the global community. Marvin A. McMickle, D-Min, PhD, is currently interim pastor of Antioch Baptist Church in Cleveland, Ohio, where he previously served as senior pastor for nearly 25 years. He has also served as past president of Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School in Rochester, New York. No stranger to academia, McMickle has previously served as professor of homiletics at Ashland Theological Seminary, and in 2009 spent a semester as a visiting professor at Yale University Divinity School. He also taught at Case Western Reserve, Cleveland State, Princeton, and Fordham universities. Thank you so much, Dr. McMickle, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, and thanks to the Western Reserve Historical Society for imagining this format and for then inviting me to be a part of it. I am so grateful to you for our friendship across a good many years. I'll just say that, across a good many years, our collegial relations, and now for this chance to work together with this By the Book series. I'm grateful by the opportunity to share with you and with all of those who are listening in on tonight. I'm going to share my screen so that others can see what it is that we're doing here and can be a part of our discussion. So this book, which is entitled Let the Oppressed Go Free, Exploring Theologies of Liberation, which came out about a year ago, about February of 2021, is an attempt to take a look at what is commonly referred to as liberation theology, stretched out over a 50-year time frame. Liberation theology is an attempt to take Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 through 29, where the Apostle Paul talks about tearing down walls of division and walls of separation, most notably for Paul in Galatians 3, the long-standing divisions that were based upon Jew and Gentile, which is a matter of ethnicity, between slave and free, which is a matter of social and economic class, and then neither male nor female, which are barriers of a division based upon gender. Liberation theology suggests that there is a strand running through the entire Bible, including the teachings in Exodus, in the biblical prophets of the Old Testament, in the ministry and teachings of Jesus, and right into the teachings of Paul, that suggest that there is more to Christian theology than matters of personal salvation. There is also this stream that persons who are being persecuted, persons who are being marginalized, persons who are facing oppression because of these three categories: oppression and life in the margins because of one's race or ethnicity, oppression or living in the margins because of one's social or economic class, or oppression and living in the margins because of one's gender, male or female, that all of that must be resisted by persons of faith. And that any theology, any attempt to understand scripture, any attempt to understand the teachings of the Bible that do not take seriously this theme of tearing down dividing walls and bringing liberation to the oppressed based upon these categories in Galatians. I say them again: oppression rooted in race and ethnicity, racism; oppression that is rooted in class and economic conditions, issues of poverty; and oppression that is rooted in matters of gender and therefore sexism. All of that is what liberation theology initially set out to address. Over the years, as you can see in bullet point number 3, liberation theology begins to take on the following terminology. First of all, Black theology, which starts around 1969. Latin American liberation theology, which is really where the issues of global poverty kick in. And then feminist and womanist theology, which is where we find aspirations for persons seeking affirmation despite the gender bias, which, by the way, does not exist simply in society in general, but has also existed within the life of faith communities in particular. So these are the terms for liberation theology. These are the categorizations: Black theology and issues of racism, Latin American liberation theology and issues of poverty, feminist and then womanist theology, and I'll separate those in a moment, and issues of gender. My study then goes beyond those because there are other communities within the faith community who have also said that they have experienced oppression and life in the margin based upon other categories. And so in my book, Let the Oppressed Go Free, there is a substantial discussion about the LGBTQ community and oppression that is rooted in matters of homophobia against persons who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. I offer a caveat by saying that the term queer theology is not my word. So I don't want anybody to think that that's particularly the way in which I'm categorizing. This is the language of the persons who are writing theology on behalf of the LGBTQ community. So I'm using their language in order for their own voices to be heard. And then Native American sovereignty theology, which is to say, as Dr. Williams said at the outset, there are voices of Indigenous persons whose experience on this continent is longer than any of the rest of us, but whose voices have been muted and eliminated the most. And so how do we let the oppressed go free, not only in terms of human sexuality, but also in terms of what the Native Americans or the Indigenous persons refer to as sovereignty theology. Next slide. The origins of Black theology can be traced primarily to this person and this book, Dr. James Cone, who in 1969 released a book entitled Black Theology and Black Power. He was at that time, and remained until his retirement, a professor at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. That book was released in 1969. I enrolled in that seminary the very next year in 1970, when other of Dr. Cone's books began to roll out to almost one a year for the next 4 or 5 years. And I had the very great privilege of not only taking classes with him, but reading the manuscripts of his subsequent books and enjoying just a warm friendship and fellowship with him and with his family and with his children. He died in 2018. Dr. Cone was the inaugural speaker when I was installed as the president at Colgate Rochester. And we were scheduled to be together with him and a few others, but it was scheduled for the week after his death. And regrettably, we were never able to have as a group that final moment. But most of Black theology is rooted in this one text. And so I want to talk about the origins of Black liberation theology. Dr. Cone began by asking a very simple question. And that question was, can you be both Black and Christian in the United States during the intense years of the 1960s? Can you be both Black and Christian? Now, go back to the title of the book, Black Theology and Black Power. In the title of the book is his way through. Because what Cone is saying is that Black power as a concept was beginning to emerge as not only a kind of a political mantra, but almost as a social force that was beginning to challenge the integrity and the authority of the Black church. If you were not pursuing Black power as then described, maybe you were irrelevant for younger people and had nothing to say. So how can you be a Christian, Black Christian, African-American Christian in the latter part of the 1960s if you are not engaging on the issue of Black power? His answer was, if you can write a theology. Now, theology is a word that simply means words, two Greek words put together. Theos is a Greek word for God. Logos is a Greek word for word. So not so much the word of God, which is the Bible, but words about God is what theology is about. You've got to have a theology that speaks about God in such a way that it addresses the issues that were at work in the latter part of the 1960s. Here is why Dr. Cone felt the need to write about Black theology. Because most of the white theologians at that time, most of the biblical scholars at that time, most of the white clergy, pastors and church leaders and denominational executives at that time, were not addressing the civil rights movement. We're not addressing issues of Black power. They were trying to avoid that conversation altogether. And they were involved, as most academicians are, in the minutia of their particular academic guild, but were not engaging in the critical issues that were at work in the world in the 1960s. And so because of their silence, because of their unwillingness to speak, he felt an obligation to step forward. Here's what he asked himself: what is the role of the Black intellectual when activism seems to be the logical course of action? Now, he was a PhD. He got a PhD from Northwestern University. He got a PhD studying a German, well, actually a Swiss theologian named Karl Barth. So James Cone was deeply rooted in this traditional theological conversation that occupied so many white theologians. But as he said in most of his writings, none of it seemed to speak to the times in which he was now alive, the late 1960s. There was a famous German theologian by the name of Paul Tillich, Tillich, and he was talking about preaching during these days. And Tillich said, preaching must always be done mindful of the present time. That's the way that James Cone thought about theology. It must be done mindful of the present time. What were those times? First bullet point, the intense years of the 1960s. And what does an African-American scholar write about, talk about, teach about, and preach about during that time? Final bullet point, what happened when Black theology was confronted with other non-racial claims of oppression and injustice, which is to say that Black people weren't the only ones who were being oppressed. Women were being oppressed because of gender. LGBT persons were being oppressed because of sexual identity. People in Latin America were being oppressed because of poverty. And so right from the beginning, Black theology was being asked to broaden its focus beyond simply matters of race to include matters of gender and matters of sexual identity and matters of social class, etc. Let's go back to the 1960s and remember what was going on 1969 when that book came out. Because these were the other voices that were at work. James Cone had to offer a theological response to the racial climate of the 1960s, while there were two competing strands calling for African Americans to come and follow them. One, I will simply identify broadly with Stokely Carmichael, who was the most outspoken advocate for Black power. In 1966, in Greenwood, Mississippi, during the March Against Fear, this is when James Meredith was shot on a highway while he was trying to walk all the way across the state of Mississippi to prove that a Black man could be free in Mississippi. Well, on the first day of that march, someone shot him from the bushes. He did not die, but he was seriously wounded. And civil rights leaders gathered from all around the country to continue that march. It was during that march, the March Against Fear, that Stokely Carmichael first introduced the phrase, "We want Black power." Now, Martin King was there, but he was not joining in that chant. He was not quite sure just yet what Carmichael meant by Black power. Was it Black political power? Yes. Was it Black economic power? Yes. Was it the right of Black people to engage in self-defense if they are attacked? Yes, it was all of that. A lot of young people were really captivated by the notion of Black power, and I was certainly one of them between 1966 and 1969. At the same time that Stokely Carmichael was pulling in the direction of Black power, and was, by the way, arguing that you do not even have to go to church in order to be in the civil rights movement. Please remember that in 1969, contrary to what you might believe, the vast majority of African American clergy were not involved in the civil rights movement. The fact that so many of the leaders of the movement, Martin King, Ralph Abernathy, Wyatt Walker, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, the fact that they were clergy might have given people the impression that that's where all Black preachers were. Not at all. Most of them were not involved. And so in a sense, what Carmichael was saying was, since most of these Black preachers are not involved in the movement, then don't even bother with them. Just bypass them altogether and get involved in Black power. At the same time, there was the Nation of Islam. Now, it is difficult in 2022, given the status of the Nation of Islam as it is today, to remember how powerful and influential it was in the 1960s. Remember now that from about 1958 until his death in 1965, the only person who could be mentioned in the same breath in terms of influence in the Black community with Martin Luther King Jr. was Malcolm X. And so during those years, the Nation of Islam was a counterforce arguing against Christianity and saying that Christianity was what they called a white man's religion. It was the religion of the oppressor. It was being used to justify white supremacy. It was being used to maintain Black subordination. And that certainly was the way in which many white Christians in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century were approaching religion, a way to sort of keep Black people pacified. And so here is James Cone in 1969 with Stokely Carmichael in one ear, we want Black power, and Malcolm X, and then Louis Farrakhan, and of course, Elijah Muhammad as the national leader of that organization, saying, you shouldn't even be a Christian in the first place. He had to respond to them in order to salvage the possibility that one could be both Black and Christian at the same time. And Black theology was his solution. I'll go to the next slide. Here were his problems. Number one, white theology was not addressing the problems being faced by Black people in the 1960s and the 1970s. This is a quote that was taken from Dr. Cone's his last book. In fact, this book came out after his death in February of 2018. And he was talking about what he perceived to be the irrelevance of European theology, which is where most American theologians were always looking for approval. You got to have somebody from France or somebody from Germany or somebody from England to say, yes, that's right, we agree. Cone said, forget all of that. Nothing was at stake, he said, in European theology. Nothing. It didn't matter. It did not matter whether Bart or Adolf Harnack was right about Revelation. He said, I was not ready to risk my life for that. It was irrelevant to the Black struggle. But he said in the same book, with Black power, everything was at stake. the affirmation of Black humanity in a white supremacist world, I was ready to die for Black dignity. If you want a definition of what is Black theology, there it is. The affirmation of Black humanity in a white supremacist world. A theology that uplifts those that white supremacy is trying to push down and subjugate and silence and marginalize and mute. And he said, in that struggle, for that cause, I'm ready to die. Now, remember, this sounds just like Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, if a person has not found something worth dying for, then they are not fit to live. So this is what Black theology was about. I'm not going to spend too much more time on it. I want to go on now to the second one and leave a little time for conversation. So the first school of thought out of the box was Black theology and issues of racism in the United States. And the question, can you be Black and Christian if Black people are pursuing Black theology, are pursuing Black power or the Nation of Islam, and if white Christians don't care about your freedom struggle? How can you remain a Christian if your issues, if your struggle, if your humanity is not being discussed? That was what James Cone was focused on. But at the same time, in Latin America, an entirely different liberation theology was also being debated. And the people who were most responsible for that were saying, for us down here in Bolivia, in Brazil, and in Peru, and in Ecuador, and in Mexico, the issue is not racism, because all of us are Peruvian. All of us are Cuban. All of us are Brazilian. The issue for us is class. It's the inequitable distribution of resources. Now we go back to Galatians chapter 3, where Paul says there are three dividing walls that must be torn down. Wall number one, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. That is ethnicity. That is racism. That's Black theology. Then said Paul, there is also neither slave nor free. Okay, that's social class and economic status. Folks who are free have all the resources. Folks who are enslaved have none. Bear in mind, there was much more slavery in Central and South America and the Caribbean than ever occurred on the land that was first British colonial North America and then eventually the United States. We think about slavery only in terms of what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, or Baltimore, Maryland, or these other slave ports in our country. Slavery was far more impactful in Latin America, and the results of that were the development of an enormous gap in economic wealth and resources. So framed within the context of Latin America, and most closely associated with the work of the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, whose book was entitled A Theology of Liberation. What an interesting thing. A Theology of Liberation. The focus is less on race and more on matters of economic inequality and the ways in which human behavior result in the perpetual poverty of some and the unlimited prosperity of others. This is as much a problem on the global scene as is racism. Not everybody who is African American is, buried down in poverty. There are people who have come out of, or at least are able to function beyond the grip of racism, but poverty is a different matter. Think of the numbers of people in this country who are either living in regular federally defined poverty, $24,000 a year for a family of four. That's just standard poverty. Or extreme poverty, which is $12,000 a year for a family of four, and that's Black and white people as well. And then the third form of poverty is what's called concentrated poverty, where you aren't the only one who is poor. Everybody around you is poor. Your whole neighborhood is poor. Your whole barrio in Latin America is poor. And so poverty comes alongside of race as a form of oppression concerning which the Christian faith has to have something to say. Here is a quote from Gustavo Gutierrez, bullet point number 2. All theological inquiry is contextual. Our context today, says Gutierrez, is characterized by a glaring disparity between the rich and the poor. No serious Christian can quietly ignore this situation. It is no longer possible for someone to say, well, I did not know about the suffering of the poor. Poverty has a visibility today it did not have in the past. Poverty is seen on cable TV. Poverty is seen as we traffic more freely in global transportation. Poverty is seen as people who travel all around the world see it for themselves and then come back and report it to us. Here is liberation theology. An active concern for the poor is not only an obligation for those who feel a political vocation. In other words, don't expect City Hall to do this. Don't look to the White House to do this. Don't fend this off on public officials. All Christians must take the gospel message of justice and equality seriously. Christians cannot forego their responsibility to say a prophetic word. That means a hard, harsh, challenging critique of the present economic structure, a prophetic word about unjust economic conditions. He continues, poverty poses a major challenge to every Christian conscience and therefore to theology. Now, here's a good point for me to inject a quote from one of my doctoral students who graduated 2 years ago. Her name was Jamie Eaddy, E-A-D-D-Y. And Jamie wrote her dissertation on what she called microaggressions against oppressed groups. Microaggressions. She said, oppression is not what happens to you in large events on a single day. Instead, oppression are those tiny little insults, those moments of being ignored, that sense of being passed over, that look that says, what are you doing here? And over time, these microaggressions build up almost to the breaking point. Now, she said in her dissertation, if the only thing you want is to have an end to your particular form of oppression, but you're not prepared to go to work to address and alleviate the oppression as experienced by others, then she concluded, you do not want liberation at all. All you want is privilege. That's what Gutierrez is saying. Poverty poses a major challenge to every Christian conscience and therefore to theology. It is not enough for Black people to focus on racism and not focus as well on issues of poverty, even if poverty does not define their own condition at any point along the way. We go back to the Apostle Paul. In Christ, says Paul, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, that is race and ethnicity. There is neither slave nor free, that is class and social status. And then says Paul, there is also neither male nor female, which now takes us to the third form of liberation theology, which is called feminist theology, which I will describe quickly going through this set of bullet points. While there are many voices that you could listen to that talk about feminist theology, I put several names on the screen. Christine Smith, who I've quoted. This is not, by the way, our local, my dear sister, Christine Smith, who's a local pastor here in Cleveland. This is Christine Smith, who is on the faculty of a seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Two wonderful Christine Smiths. One is here, one is in Minneapolis. This is the one in Minneapolis. And she quotes, "Sexism involves the systematic denial, exploitation, and oppression of women as the hierarchical structuring of personal and social reality. Sexism assures and secures male domination." That's what feminist theology tries to tackle. The hierarchical structuring of personal and social reality designed in order to assure and secure male domination. Now, here's the fact of the matter. Male domination does not just mean white male domination. Because in African American churches, there are, much to my dismay, much to my embarrassment, in a number of Black men who will fight you to the death in order to end racism, but will also fight you to the death if you try to get them to end sexism, because they really believe that men ought to have the upper hand and the last word in the life of the church. So we've now moved beyond issues of race and beyond issues of poverty to another category, which is sexism, structured in such a way as to keep men in charge and to minimize the power and opportunities of women, especially in the life of the church. Bullet point number 3, the issue extends beyond the issue of leadership roles in the church. It also involves the following things. Reproductive rights. Somebody has to explain to me why old, 70 years old, 75-year-old white men in the US Congress are so worried about a woman's right to choose. Because they think they ought to be able to tell women what their rights are and not let them make these decisions for themselves. Reproductive rights does not necessarily mean I'm going to get an abortion. It means it is my right to make the choice. And the government ought not be imposing its restrictions upon me. We're right on the cusp, I'm afraid, of the Supreme Court ruling of Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed women reproductive rights. We're right on the cusp of having that declared unconstitutional with this newly constituted Supreme Court. This is an issue for feminist theology. And then wage disparities for the same job. Women almost always get paid less than their male counterparts for the same job. Battery and sexual violence. The depiction and treatment of women in popular culture, and especially on matters of pornography. Feminist theology wants to look at all of these things, and here are some more scholars in that field: Rosemary Radford Ruther, Letty Russell, and Phyllis Tribble. These are the theological voices. Of course, Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and others were feminists, but not in a theological sense. But then Black women came along and said, wait a minute. we have something else to add to this. Because while white women were being restricted because of gender, they were still white women in a white supremacist culture. And many of them, I don't mean to say all, but many of them were not the victims of poverty because they were married to people who might have some resource. So many African American women said the notion of feminist theology does not really speak to our reality. And so they introduced their own form and formula, which they call womanist theology. They borrowed the term womanist from a book by Alice Walker, In My Mother's Gardens, where she uses the term womanish, which talks about girls who are not content to act as some people thought girls should act at a certain age. And I recommend that you read Alice Walker and that book. But Jacqueline Grant, who was one of my seminary classmates, introduced a term that she calls tri-dimensional experience. She says that Black women fit a particular profile that hardly anybody else does. They are at the same time victims of poverty, many of them, women raising children by themselves, not being paid as much as their male counterparts, poverty. They are Black, so they're the victims of racism. And they're women, so they're the victims of gender bias. Add all three of those things together, and you've got a unique experience. Poor Black women living in a capitalistic and patriarchal culture. And here's the bad part, where the Black church is an active agent in one's own oppression. The Black church is no more open, no more inviting, no more welcoming to Black women in many places. Now, it's beginning to melt in some places, but my goodness, there are places where we're living in the 19th century. And, this whole rise of white evangelical Christianity and, sort of denying women any role in the ministry. This is what womanist theology is trying to do, is to address the unique experience of African-American women who are living in poverty. That one typo, Black men may experience racism and white women may experience sexism, but many Black women experience all three: racism, sexism, and poverty. Here is one way that I've come to think about this, and I talk about this in the book. Black women also had the terrible experience of having both work capacity, meaning in slavery and in subsequent years, and womb capacity, meaning that in slavery especially, after they worked all day in whatever line of work they were in the fields, in the house, in the kitchen, whatever, they were also raped at night. Raped for the pleasure of their white owners, and raped in order to produce more slaves. Please remember that the United States Constitution outlawed the transatlantic slave trade effective 1808. So you could not legally import the same number of slaves who were, or the enslaved persons, I'll use that phrase. You couldn't import them as you had been doing since 1619. So rather than buying more slaves, white slave owners decided that they could just as easily produce their own by turning Black women not only into workers, but to exploit their womb. Think of that, working all day and then raped all night. What a terrible experience that must have been. I want to go ahead to this, and then I'll come back. So now we've done the Apostle Paul's first three categories: neither Jew nor Gentile, race and ethnicity; neither slave nor free, social class and economics; neither male nor female, which is gender bias; And now we come to not so much gender bias, but gender identity. I must confess there are not many churches that are prepared to have a discussion about gender identity because they think they know what the Bible says. They think they know. They think that Leviticus 18, verse 22, which refers to same-sex activity as an abomination, and Romans 1, verses 24 to 27, that refers to it as people who've been given over by God to wild and uncontrollable lusts. They think that that's what the Bible says. Okay, so here is my initial response. If you would like to talk about LGBT activity based upon Leviticus 18:22, because the Bible says something, then my invitation is to say, well, let's read the rest of Leviticus. Let's read the part of Leviticus that says that you ought not wear clothing made of more than one fabric. Or let's read the part of Leviticus that says you ought not eat food that comes inside of shells. Or let's read the part of Leviticus that says you ought not eat meat that still has blood in it. Now, all of that and more is in Leviticus. Well, you see, I have folks who say, well, all of that was then, but now we can eat shellfish and we can eat, pretty raw, rare meat, and we can wear a silk and wool suit. Yeah, because you made an exemption because it's convenient for you, but you hold on to Leviticus 18:22. I often get the biggest kick out of imagining this. Imagine this with me, that a group of preachers wearing silk and wool suits are sitting in Red Lobster, eating lobster and shrimp and crab legs while they talk about LGBTQ persons as being ungodly, when everything that they're doing at that moment is in the same book from which they quote. Or Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27. But you see, Romans chapter 1, verses 24 and 27, to the extent that it mentions same-sex activity, then goes on. So if you want to read that verse in that way, then it goes on to say, and he also gave them over to greed and to anger and to malicious speech and to divisive conduct and to jealousy and to all kinds of other things, which people, dismiss as, okay, I'm not going to worry about that so long as I'm safe on the issue of LGBTQ practices. This is called convenient reading of Scripture. You read the parts that support you, you ignore the parts that you don't want to deal with because they might touch upon your own life. Well, here's why it's important. Because really all that LGBTQ people are saying is, this is not about whether or not we're in the church. God knows that LGBTQ persons have been in the church from the beginning. The question for the 21st century is whether or not they can be ordained to share in the ministry and whether or not their marriages can be consecrated in the church. That is why this has become such a hot button issue. Queer theology tries to raise the issue of whether or not the Bible is really condemning their behavior and whether or not there is any room for them in the life of the church. And at the moment, I will tell you that most churches have not yet gotten around to this one. They are still holding out on any open affirmation of this. But the persons who are LGBTQ are not holding out, and they are insisting that this issue be addressed. And I don't think they're going to go anywhere anytime soon. So in my book, I tried to at least introduce their voices. So now we've covered the following: Black theology and race, liberation theology and class and economics, feminist and womanist theology and gender, queer theology and issues of human sexuality, sexual identity, LGBTQ. And then we come finally, in my book, to American Indian, this is their term, or Native American liberation theology. This is an attempt to say that the Christian faith has not been kind to Native American people. And America has not been kind to Native American people. A lot of African Americans take great exception to the fact that in the United States Constitution, in the first article, African Americans are referred to as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional representation and taxation of landowners. How do you count slaves in order to decide how many people go to Congress from your state and how much tax you owe? In the same clause that says you shall count all white persons as one whole person, all white indentured persons as one whole person, and all others as 3/5 of a person, that clause concludes by saying Native Americans, well, it really says Indians, Indians not to be counted. Did you know that? But the United States Constitution wrote Native Americans out of any future in this country. Bullet point number 2, how do we as Christians talk about God in light of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which required all Native Americans living on the east side of the Mississippi River to forcibly be removed to the west side? That became what was known as the Trail of Tears, where Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Choctaw Creek, and Seminole Indians, 45,000 or more, were forcibly removed because President Andrew Jackson wanted their land. Now, this would be Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas. He wanted their land for the expansion of slavery and the expansion of cotton production. Think about, bury my heart at Wounded Knee, another forced migration of Native Americans in South Dakota. Think more recently about Standing Rock in the state of North Dakota, where oil pipelines were being installed over land that by treaty had been given to the Lakota Sioux Indians. But of course, we've never honored any treaty that we've made with Native Americans. And so they have said, our experience, our humanity needs a theological discussion, and they have written what they call a sovereignty theology, which simply says we cannot live by the same understanding of Scripture that has guided white Christians all of these years. We have our own culture, we have our own traditions, we have our own understanding of the way in which we keep time. You know, we don't live by a linear sense, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, this year, next decade, next century. We live in a cyclical world. We're guided by seasons. We're guided by moons. We're guided by another way to think about life. So liberation theology, you see, extends even to these groups of people who are simply saying, to use the common vernacular, me too. Me too. I taught theology for 30 years in various schools. And whenever I taught about Black theology and I thought I'd done a good job, I would have a Latin American student say, okay, that's good about race, but me too, about poverty. I would have a female student say, pretty good on race, but me too in terms of gender. I would have a LGBTQ student say, pretty good, but me too in terms of sexual identity. And I would even have a Native American student say, pretty good, but you've not gotten anywhere near our experience. So keep writing theology until all voices have been included. So that's what this book is about. It is about the ever expanding discussion about how do you move people from the margins into the mainstream of the life of the church and the life of society, using the Bible as a way to say that God wants all of the oppressed to be set free. The title, Let the Oppressed Go Free, is taken from the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 58, where Isaiah is saying that God is not interested in you if the only thing you've got to offer are religious rituals. God doesn't care about you if the only thing you want to talk about is fasting and praying and, communion and baptism, but you don't want to get involved in loosening the bonds of oppression and letting the oppressed go free. If that's all the church is going to do, the church is going to get left behind by this new generation. Remember, these last two movements, Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, both started outside of the church because the church was not prepared to engage in these questions. And if the church does not catch up and does not move on and find out how it can play a larger role in the Black Lives Matter movement and in the Me Too movement, the one that deals with sexual assault, then we're going to find ourselves irrelevant in the future. So let me stop there, Dr. Williams, and come out of stop share, and we can go Q&A for as long as you would like.
Sure. Okay, thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. It's a great book too. I've said to people they can preview the book on Amazon, but I'm asking people not to buy it on Amazon. If you're local and you can make your way to the Western Reserve Historical Society, certainly. And if you're a member, if you buy it from the museum store, you get a discount. So there's a way to support the authors in the series and also a way to support local institutions, Jobs for Ohioans, if you can buy it from the museum. And certainly there are lots of other online sources. You can go to the website for Judson Press, the publisher of the book. And again, this is number 18, right, Reverend McMickle's?
This is number 18, yes.
Okay, and they can purchase the book from the publisher. But I can certainly, if people have questions, unmute folks. Well, actually, I have to ask you, if you can, unmute yourselves. If you have questions, or raise your hand. I'm gonna check the chat here to see if people have questions here. Looking, okay. People are inspired, Pastor McMickle. Are you reading the chat also?
Yes, I can, but okay. I'm gonna let you direct me to the ones you want me to speak to.
Well, I wanted to, this is a personal bias of mine, or just an observation regarding the sexism, because there was a statement in the book related to your mother's experience on a certain church search committee, where someone suggested they'd rather go with the least qualified man than the most qualified woman. Yes. And so maybe that was a few years ago. But do you think we've made progress in that area? And if so, what is the measure of our success when it comes to dealing with that kind of blatant sexism?
Well, I will do this by giving the people on the call a challenge. Name for me the churches in Cleveland, never mind the suburban areas. Just name for me the churches in Cleveland that have a female senior pastor. And if you can get beyond 10 in a town that's got over 200 African-American churches of different denominations and different sizes, I would be surprised. So the answer is no. Some churches may have female staff. Some churches may invite female preachers. The real challenge is going to be the degree to which churches are prepared to call equally trained, sometimes even superior preaching women to be their senior pastor. then we'll know that we're making progress. My experience, Dr. Williams, has been the following. When I taught at Ashland, when I taught at Yale, when I taught at Princeton, and then for those years that I was at Colgate, we had no problem placing our male graduates. No problem at all. We had the most difficult time placing in local churches that were Black denominations our female graduates. So many of them ended up going into the chaplaincy or going into academia, to teach because they could not get a job in the ministry. Right here in Cleveland, my first female associate was just a tremendously gifted person named Tanya Fields. She was a student of mine when I was at Princeton. Lo and behold, when I came here, she was here. She served with us for about 10 years. We then tried to get her placed into a Black Baptist church anywhere in Greater Cleveland. Not one church would even think about her. Undergraduate degree from Bishop College, master's from Princeton, great preacher, great singer, great person. So she ended up going into a white denomination where they would hire her. So I think we got a long way to go.
Okay. Thank you so much. I met her when she was my pastor at St. Paul United Methodist Church.
That's the church. That's the church she went to. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And she couldn't get a job in the Black Baptist church.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. There are a number of questions here. There was a concern about sexism. So I think this is from Patrice Hamilton, how you address sexism and queer theology in your own church.
Well, sexism is the best way to address sexism is to hire people. You see, it is to demonstrate, as you discovered with Tanya Fields, if you think that a woman is not as competent as a man, then give that woman an opportunity to prove it. With the first time that Reverend Fields served communion at Antioch, I got a note from an anonymous source, of course, it's always anonymous, that said, unless I got that woman from behind that communion table, she and many others were going to leave Antioch and never come back, because they didn't want a woman handling the communion elements. So, I decided, okay, there's no way to get around this. So the next Sunday, I read this letter and I said, this is what a member of Antioch said about Reverend Fields serving communion. So here's my answer. Any of you who would like for me to write you a letter of transfer to another church where they do not have women who serve communion, I'd be happy to provide you with one, because she's not going anywhere. And if you can't stand to have her here, I'd be happy to give you a letter to any church where you want to go. So number one, you have to help to elevate women into positions where they can exercise their gift, and then support them when the pushback comes. That for me, so we've got female deacons and we've got female clergy, and I've tried to be on the forefront of that most of my life, because my own first pastor, as I said in the book, was Mary G. Evans. So it's hard for me to have a bias against women in the ministry when the first preacher I ever heard was a woman. Issues of queer theology, I think you have to help people do two things. One is you have to ask people, do you think that God has not made any provision for people whose sexual identity is defined by a biological predisposition? I don't know, Dr. Williams. I do not know. I don't have the qualifications to say that to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender is a behavioral choice that someone chooses for themselves, or a biological predisposition. This is how God made me. I'm inclined to lean in the direction of those who say, this is who I am This is not what I choose to do. I don't hold that against those persons any more than gender against women or race against Black people. I take you as you come. I would rather face God on the day of judgment and be guilty of inclusion than to face God on the day of judgment and be guilty of exclusion on the basis of factors that I don't even understand. So when someone comes to the church and says, "This is who I am, this is this is my identity," I'm not prepared to close the door on that. Now, I've never been invited to do a same-sex marriage, so I can't speak to that reality. Most people who want a marriage do not necessarily want the church to do it. They don't mind going to a judge or going to a lawyer or going to somebody else to do it. They just want to be affirmed in their humanity. Now, that being said, let me go back to the book. You cannot bash gay and lesbian people on the basis of Leviticus 18 and Romans chapter 1, and at the same time, continue to engage in all the other behaviors that Leviticus 18 and Romans chapter 1 also talk about. That's the hypocrisy. I want to say that this is a sin, but not greed, not jealousy, not anger, not division, not anything else. Or I want to say, okay, gay activity is an abomination, but I can get around eating shellfish. I can get around silk and wool suits. I can get around all that because that was then, and this is now. No, you can't read the Bible so that it suits your convenience. This is an uphill battle. Most African-American churches are just beginning to engage on the issue of women. I cannot imagine how long it's going to take for churches, Black and white, to be honest about the presence of and the humanity of their LGBTQ brothers and sisters. But what they want is what all of us want. Leave me alone. Frederick Douglass was often quoted as saying, the only thing we want white people to do for us is leave us alone. We can make it. Just if you would just stop interfering, if you would just stop, turning back voting rights, for instance, if you would just stop turning back reproductive rights, if you would just stop, if you would just get out of this, we could navigate our way through. I think the same thing is true for LGBTQ persons. They're not asking for a whole lot from us, except don't condemn us, don't judge us, don't push us away, don't marginalize us, don't dehumanize us, don't turn us into the butt of jokes and because here's the reality: heterosexual people, by and large, have the same divorce rate as homosexual couples. We have the same people who practice infidelity as heterosexuals really they shouldn't say anything about anybody else's sexual practice. It's just hypocritical. So, I think you got to take this on head on. I'm of an age now where, I'm not trying to win friends or influence people in that sense. I've outgrown all of my biases. I cannot say that I felt this way about LGBTQ issues all my life because I was born and raised in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. It was pretty common in those days to harbor a certain sense of that. But I've long since outgrown all of that. And Jim Cone is a large reason why, because he kept saying, and my student, Jimmy Eady, if the only thing you want to work on is to end your oppression, but you don't want to hear about and work to end other people's oppression, even if it doesn't affect you, then you don't want liberation. You just want privilege. That's my answer.
Okay, thank you. And again, I think that was from Patrice. Barbara, did you have your hand up? Barbara's iPhone. I don't need to unmute you. You're okay. I don't need to ask you to unmute. Okay. As long as you're
I was giving Dr. McMickle a loud hand clap.
Oh, is that what that was? I thought you were raising your hand. Thank you. Okay, thank you. But Dr. McMickle, I just want to look at some of the other comments in the chat. Looking now at Kathy's comment to everyone that all men should be as worried about the outcome of the Supreme Court's decision on reproductive justice as women. Impressed with the support of clergy for reproductive rights, she says. Is that something you'd like to comment on or show?
Yes, I think I wish people could think about reproductive rights and not think about abortion as a synonym. Abortion may be one outcome of reproductive rights, but that's not the issue. The issue of reproductive rights is who gets to make the decision about what I do with my own body. Should state legislatures, driven by twisted political and religious ideologies, have the last word on whether or not a woman should or shouldn't, can or cannot bring a pregnancy to term? Is that the government's job, or is that a woman's right to choose in consultation with her physician and with, if she's got any spiritual guidance, a pastor, a rabbi, a priest, an imam, if it's just her and her family? It's a question of rights. Now, what I do with my rights, that's a different matter. I want the right to vote. I don't want, people in Texas and Georgia and Pennsylvania and Georgia and now in the US Senate limiting my right. Who I vote for is my business. The right to vote is what we're talking about. Well, the same thing that happened yesterday when they refused to affirm even a discussion about that right. Reproductive rights is a right. I think that all men ought to have this concept in their head. Abortion is one possible outcome. A woman might choose to bring the child to term and put it up for adoption. She might choose to raise the child, but it's her choice. But the government ought not have anything to say about this, is my judgment. I don't think we've won the battle because the Supreme Court is going to, I think, throw us back to pre-1960s, and we're going to find that women, and by the way, this doesn't affect all women. If you can leave a state that's got abortion restrictions and go to a state and you can afford the procedure, you're not affected by this. You can still go forward. Here again, it's usually people living in poverty who don't have the means to go from state to state. White women, by and large, will have more opportunities than Hispanic and Indigenous and African American women who might have an economic restraint. But this is on us. This is as current an issue as voting rights, is reproductive rights. I'd be stunned if the Supreme Court this year or next doesn't overturn Roe v. Wade.
Okay. Well, thank you for those comments. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that I'm being attentive to the other comments because they may require commentary from you as well. But this is from Cindy. As you discussed sexism in the Black church and racism within feminism, it made me wonder what you believe about, or what you believe can or should be done about continuing prejudices among those who are committed to one liberation theology, yet refuse to see the other oppressions, let alone support the other liberation theologies.
Yeah.
I think to address some of that.
Yeah. Well, you see, that's sort of the underlying premise of the book. That's why it's called Exploring Theologies of Liberation. I could have just done another book on Black theology, except that people who are living with poverty say, well, what about me? Women say, both white women with feminist theology and Black women with womanist theology, what about gender? Mm-hmm. And then LGBTQ persons say, what about sexual identity? And then Native Americans and Indigenous persons say, what about, none of you all are feeling anything remotely close to the level of oppression that we have historically felt and continue to feel. The highest levels of homicide, the highest levels of suicide, the highest levels of domestic violence, the highest levels of drug and alcohol addiction, the highest levels of homelessness and poverty are all on Native American reservations. And they can hardly get their voices heard because people have always wanted to take from them land, mineral rights, and never do anything to protect their humanity and their territory. So I would say, going back to my doctoral student, Jamie Eady, if the only thing you want is an end to your own form of oppression, but you're not willing to work for, never mind just here, work for the end of the oppression of others, whether you feel that oppression or not, then you don't want liberation. You want privilege. And privilege, whether it's white privilege or male privilege or heterosexual privilege or privilege of persons who are not Native American, if that's all you want, then you want privilege. And we're not writing about a black theology of privilege. We're talking about a black theology of liberation.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to respond also to your earlier comment about how your views have changed over time as you've grown, as you've learned of the plights of other people. And I don't know if I want to use that term because, Dr. William Barber, he doesn't like the othering of people. So
yeah.
Every time I put that in a sentence, let me find another way to say that. But the diversity in America to consider the experiences of different groups in the society without othering them. There's nothing wrong with being different than other groups in the society. But, I thought about something that Dr. Cohn wrote. And I just want to ask you which book it was. I don't know if it was a theology, the Black theology book or Black theology and Black power. But he said in the 25th anniversary edition of one of those books that in the first edition, he didn't mention the name of a single woman. Not one, not Harriet Tubman, not Sojourner Truth. And I want to say that it was the Black Liberation book and not the one with the Black power. But do you know offhand? Because there's another.
He has repented about that. And I might add, a lot of his Black doctoral students helped him to repent of that by reminding him that not in Black Theology and Black Power, which was the first book, and not in a Black Theology of Liberation, which was the second book, and not in God of the Oppressed, which was the third book. Not in any of those did he quote from the experiences of women. And I think that's really where womanist theology was partially birthed. They realized that Black men might either intentionally or accidentally leave them out. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if Cohn, sort of the head of the story, if he can leave them out, then the lesser lights could leave them out. So their decision was, listen, let's do this ourselves. And that's where people like Renita Weems and Dolores Williams and Emily Towns and Ebony Marshall Terman and Jacqueline Grant, that's where all of them came from, telling their own story for fear that there might not be enough people who are not women who can tell their story. And as you know, in my book, I tried to just get out of the way and devote a whole chapter to let these, No, it's called Listen to These Women. And I just found 8 women with different stories about their experience in the Black church, and just let them talk. Just tell us what's happened to you. Tell us how the church has received you. Tell us how your male colleagues have treated you. Just talk. Just tell us your story. And they are powerful stories.
Yes. Okay. So again, it's in more than one James Cone book that he had that problem. But I was holding an autographed copy of one of his books that I got at the McCrary Center.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just really a bold statement to make, to confess. Yeah. You didn't even mention the name of a single woman, let alone, ask her to share her experiences. But anyway, he grew, from that early period.
Well, and you know why he grew? He grew because people in the other group that had been left out pushed him to grow.
Okay.
That's where growth comes from. You see, I don't know that it ever happens just voluntarily. I think it's because somebody says to you, well, what about me? See, my growth was driven by students who said, that was a really good lecture on liberation theology as a matter of race, but what about gender? What about poverty? What about sexual identity? What about Native Americans? Now, the group that's now emerging, Dr. Williams, are Asian American Pacific Islanders who are saying, well, listen, we've got a story too. Don't forget the 1880 Chinese Exclusion Act. So while we were, having an experience on the east side of the country, on the west side of the country, they were, locking these folks out. And on the southern border, they were knocking out Mexican Americans. I mean, this issue of exclusion is so broad in service to white supremacy. No African Americans, no Native Americans, no Hispanic Americans, no Asian Americans, just us. And, people in those excluded groups have the right to say, no, I refuse to be silenced. And if you won't tell my story, then I'll tell it myself.
Okay. And we're coming to the close of our 90-minute session together. And thank you, everyone, for your comments and for your interest in this topic. But there's a comment / question from Jim Scott to everyone. And Doctor, what percentage would you say of Black churches embrace and or practice Black liberation theology?
A percentage less than 25. I think the Black church, like its white counterparts, has gotten caught up in one of two themes: either personal salvation, are you saved, or prosperity theology, God wants you to be healthy and wealthy. Because those forms don't require any action on your part. You're saved and that's it. Or, you get money, God wills it, that's it. Liberation theology requires work. It requires commitment. It requires risk. A friend of mine, now deceased, named William Augustus Jones Jr., once said, the work of liberation is always the work of a minority. And if you wait for the crowd to show up, you'll never get anything done. So I don't think there are many churches, even in Cleveland, that would define themselves or define their ministry as influenced by liberation theology, in part because of the way the clergy were trained, what school they may have gone to, and in part because the church may not be interested in that kind of thing. And that's the problem, is you have to preach to the church about what the Bible actually says. And that why going to church and involving yourself in rituals and religious practice, but you're not doing the work of justice and mercy and righteousness, is totally inadequate.
Okay, and thank you so much for those comments. I was just scrolling through the other comments to make sure that that you had addressed them, and I think you have. Dr. Carolyn Gordon mentioned Dr. Cone getting caught up with his sort of coming and omitting women in the cross and the lynching tree. And I haven't read that one yet. I heard him give a presentation on that book at the American Academy of Religion conference, but I have not read that one. Carolyn Gordon, I will read that, but is there something that you would like to say about his thesis in that book?
Me or her?
Well, you.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right.
I think she's right. I think that is the book. He came out pretty hard against Reinhold Niebuhr in that book, but the premise of the cross and the lynching tree is that there is a perfect parallel between the way in which people in power crucified Jesus, and that the lynching tree was the 19th and 20th century form of a cross. It was where people were physically killed and beaten, and that if you've got a theology that does not address the lynching tree, the experience of African Americans who were intentionally murdered, usually without any reprisal in terms of the groups that did it. If you're silent on that, it doesn't matter what else you say in the Bible. And he really took a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr, an American Protestant theologian, to task, because Niebuhr was the major white American theologian of the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He talked about poverty, he talked about economic injustice, but he never talked about race. And Cone just lit him up for being silent on that issue. And I think it was in the context of your being silent on issues that he got around to his own silence on issues of gender and issues of homophobia. He moved into all of those categories, none of which were part of his early upbringing in the AME Church in Bearden, Arkansas.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, and I know we started at about 5 after 6, but in order for us to have given folks a full 90-minute experience, we would have 2 additional minutes to wrap things up. So let me say as my final remark that our president, Kelly Falcone Hall, the Western Reserve Historical Society president and CEO, sent through the chat to everyone. Thank you, Dr. McMickle, for your time and a fascinating presentation. WRHS is proud and pleased to host you this evening, and I certainly hope our paths cross again soon at WRHS. Thank you, Dr. Williams. Oh, that's me, for facilitating this evening's presentation. Have a good evening, everyone. And again, Kelly, did you want to unmute your mic, or you may? I know you can read for yourself, but what do you think? Is there something else that you would share to us?
Only to say thank you. It's been a pleasure, and have a wonderful evening.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Please remember that the books are available in the bookstore, and know that our next presentation will be delivered by a sociologist, Harvard University trained sociologist, with a new book from, I think her book was published in 2021, but the title of it is Black Privilege. And Dr. McMickle, Dr. Cassie Pittman Claytor with this Stanford University book is looking at African Americans who don't necessarily have a ghetto narrative to share, but they have these credentials and they have these resources, including money to spend, and they choose to be activists. And so that's the measure of the privilege that they enjoy, not just a darker version of white privilege, but again, having resources and using them to improve or to challenge the status quo and improve the quality of life for other people. So that's her book. I'm still reading it, but that will be on Thursday evening, March 3rd. And I'm hoping certainly that some of you will choose to be part of that discussion. Dr. Claytor is on the faculty at Case Western Reserve University. She's a brilliant young scholar. Hopefully when I see her on March 3rd, she will be able to tell me that she has tenure. She went up for tenure last year, and I don't know the outcome of that case, but I know she had a very, very strong list of publications and service and excellent teaching. So thank you so much for sharing this evening. I hope that we will see some of the readers, and I know there's some writers in the group as well, at some of the other presentations, and that perhaps you might consider taking out a membership in the Western Reserve Historical Society, and then enjoy the privilege a free admission to all facilities for a year for that 1-year membership. And again, discounts on the book purchases. Thank you, everyone. Dr. McMickle, I don't know if we need a benediction, but would you like to have the last word?
Well, thank you. I think it's always appropriate to thank the host and the moderator and the person who is responsible for planning all of this. I'm here because you asked me to do this. And there are some people to whom I readily say no. I just don't want to be bothered. But when you asked me to do this, given our long friendship and my high regard for you as a scholar over the years, I just rushed at the opportunity to be with you. I'm sorry that we could not do this face to face in the confines of the building, but given tonight's weather, I'm kind of glad that it worked out this way, because the snow might have kept us from being together at all. So thank you for all that you do, Dr. Williams, and thank you for including me in tonight's program.
Well, and again, thank you for being a co-host. Thank you for asking the question about whether I could make you a co-host and forcing me to learn how to do that. And thanks also to my second co-host, Mr. Chad Malkamaki, who's the go-to guy for all my technology questions at the Western Reserve Historical Society. Thank you, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.